So what we're going to do today is talk about England from the Renaissance through the First World War. And so there's a lot to go over here, so we'll kind of move fast with this and hit the high points. So we already went over the Renaissance and its influence on Italy and its beginnings there. And so in the map in the bottom center, you can see the spread of the Renaissance to the north, partially as a result of trade, but in large degree as a result of the printing press. So as the Renaissance makes its way north through trade and printing and people going to Italy and studying, then it is transformed to some degree as it moves. It becomes suited to the area. So in England, what that is going to mean is that we have a lot of printing in the vernacular. So it becomes part of a movement in England in the direction of using English as more or less a state language rather than French or Latin. And it is obviously going to allow a lot of people to read sources and come up with their own opinions on them. And that's going to be a big part of the Renaissance in the North in general and in England in particular. And so one of the key figures in the Renaissance in the northern part of Europe is Thomas More, who wrote Utopia. So he is part of a movement known as Christian humanism. As the Renaissance moves away from Rome, it is liberated from the restrictions of the Catholic Church to some degree or another. And we begin to see figures like More here or Erasmus in the Low Countries criticize the Catholic Church's practices. They were not arguing that the Catholic Church should be broken or split apart. They were arguing that the Catholic Church had lost its way to some degree or another. And so in Utopia, More paints the picture of a society that lived according to Christian principles, even though they had never come into contact with Christians. It's making the point that you don't need the Bible and you don't need the church to follow Christian principles. You just need to do the right thing and not covet possessions and that sort of thing. And then Shakespeare we would also group as part of the Northern Renaissance writers because he is formalizing English. By writing in English and by being as influential as he is as a playwright, he helps to create English as a written language. So what we have with these two figures kind of in addition is the pioneers in the creation of a national identity. That starts in England earlier than in most other parts of Europe. So kind of the bigger picture here is that we have an ideology in humanism that is encouraging people to challenge the established institutions. And so that would be the Catholic Church. And it's increasingly going to challenge things like feudalism as being irrational and kind of the old forms of monarchy as well. So another current in history during this time is the centralization under new monarchs. New monarchs were essentially feudal monarchs that had centralized powers to a greater degree than your earlier feudal monarchs. They were, generally speaking, still allowing nobles to have some of the feudal responsibilities they had before, military responsibilities or responsibilities over courts, but they were enlarging their personal armies. They generally were creating new forms of taxes. And so we have here highlighted Henry VII. Henry VII comes to power after the War of the Roses. And so he sees himself as obligated to bring under control overpowerful nobles. And during his time, he was able to get away with using a private court called the Court of the Star Chamber, what was really the meeting place of his council, in order to put nobles on trial. And so when you put nobles on trial in the Star Chamber, it meant that you were suspending rights that had been considered English rights. They didn't have a right to jury, they didn't have a right to see the evidence, it only took two accusers. And so in England, we see a particularly powerful version of new monarchy. We could consider Henry VIII and then Elizabeth as being new monarchs as well. So the types of religious centralization that follows Henry VII could be considered part of that new monarchy. So the Star Chamber I mentioned already, this is going to come up again in English history. It is an unconstitutional court because of the way it suspends rights that had been granted, in particular to nobles, going back to the Magna Carta. But during this time, after a civil war, people were willing to allow Henry VII to use it. They viewed the nobles as a bigger threat than the king using the Star Chamber. So later on, when the Star Chamber comes back, it will be seen as more of a threat to people's rights. And the other thing that's going on here is that trade in Europe is on the rise. And when we get to the period right around 1600, then England in particular is really going to take off. But already we have an enlarged middle class. And this enables new monarchs like Henry VII to promote members of this new middle class to positions of responsibility rather than relying on the nobles. And again, this is going to lead directly into the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, in a way, is an effort by monarchs to centralize control over religion, or you could see it the other way, to use religion as a way of controlling the political situation to a greater degree than before. That brings us to the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation, this division of the Catholic Church into Protestant churches and Catholic churches, gets going in Germany. And when it starts, when Luther begins to break away from the church in Germany, the King of England at that point, Henry VIII, was strong on the side of the Pope. And so there's no real doctrinal reason for the Reformation in England. There's no disagreement over salvation or over the Bible. The main reason is that the king, again, wants greater control. And in particular, in this case, the king wants a divorce. So what we have is an example of what's called magisterial or top-down reform. The king has decided there's a new church, so there's a new church. Or later on, when Elizabeth changes the doctrines of the church, then congratulations, all of you Englishmen now have a new doctrine to follow. It's not what John Calvin wanted, which is a group of believers being the priesthood of all believers, where they more democratically decide religious doctrine. This is decided by the king. So Henry VIII is motivated, he says, by a desire to have a male heir. So coming shortly after the Civil War, the War of the Roses in England, there's something to this. No female had ever successfully inherited the English throne. There had always been some kind of civil conflict. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given birth to a daughter and was now of an age where she seemed unlikely to give birth to another heir. But we can't ignore the fact that Henry VIII was looking to assert himself as a monarch and to grab more power. And so what follows his divorce definitely pushes us in that direction. And so he is motivated by that. And so remember, these marriages of monarchs were political alliances. And so Henry VIII is correct. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed in its purpose of producing an heir. And so it was often the case that the Pope granted an annulment or a divorce in this case, and in these kinds of cases. But in this situation, the Reformation is going on. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is in control of Rome. And so the Pope turns Henry down. So if this had been any other time, that would have been the end of that. But it's during the Reformation. Henry VIII takes advantage of the chaos of the Reformation and the weakness of the church, and he creates his own church. And so the other part of this is the economic motive. As we move in the direction of a money economy, it is to the advantage of European monarchs and princes to seize church lands so they can tax them directly. This was particularly true in countries like England, where there wasn't a close alliance between the monarchy and the church. So in Spain and France, where the monarchs were essentially allowed to control the church hierarchy in those countries, then they already had this advantage. And so there's this economic motive as well, which we know because Henry VIII seized the church's land and wealth promptly after creating his own Church of England and gave much of that wealth to his supporters. which helps to cement the church. It causes the church to outlast Henry. So Henry dies. He, after his third marriage, or as a result of his third marriage, does have a male heir, Edward, who dies as a teenager, and the throne then reverts to his daughter Mary anyway, who is known in history as Bloody Mary, persecutes Protestants. She doesn't last long as a result of a stomach tumor, and Elizabeth inherits the throne. And so once again, we have this top-down type of reform. Elizabeth had been raised as a Protestant, so she reestablishes the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. She establishes a state church. So technically, if you wanted to have any kind of authority in England, if you wanted to be part of the government, you did have to belong to the Church of England and pay its dues. But otherwise, Elizabeth I is part of this new group of political leaders that we're going to see that valued domestic peace over political unity. So unlike the Spanish, who would hunt you down with the Inquisition if you slightly disagreed with them over church doctrine, Elizabeth I was willing to allow sleeping dogs to lie. So if as long as you gave lip service to her religion, you could be a Catholic or you could be a Puritan, as long as you didn't flaunt it. And so this, it does establish a peace. And so England really takes off under Elizabeth. England had been a second-rate power up until this time, and England is going to emerge after Elizabeth as an expansionist and first-rate European power. So the other thing we have to note is that there are cracks beneath the surface here. Elizabeth I is able to establish religious and political peace, in large part because of her personal popularity and her ability to appeal to English citizens. But subsequent monarchs are not going to have those same strengths. And so if we look at what's going on here, one is that Henry VIII and Elizabeth both use Parliament to legitimize this religious change. So while Parliament acted in large part as a rubber stamp for those two monarchs, they were inadvertently enhancing the power and authority of Parliament by using Parliament to pass new acts like the Act of Supremacy. Then we also have dissenters, Protestant dissenters from the Church of England, the Puritans, who were unhappy with Elizabeth's religious settlement, but really not able to do much while she's the monarch. And so these two groups are ultimately going to join forces. Some of the parliamentary leaders who sought a more active role for Parliament will be Puritans. And so they're going to push for both agendas simultaneously. The Reformation creates this version of Protestantism in England that was different from other versions of Protestantism. Other versions of Protestantism relied more on personal interpretation of the Bible and focused more on new doctrines regarding salvation. At first, what we would see in England is really just a Catholic church, but with the king at the top. But as time goes on, the Church of England does become more Protestant. It becomes more Protestant in its rules regarding priests. It becomes more Protestant in its interpretation of things like communion. And so then the English are going to see themselves as kind of natural allies with other Protestant states. And this is what gets the English involved in the Dutch Revolt. So in the Netherlands, you had a rebellion against the Spanish, who had tried to both enforce Catholicism throughout the Netherlands, in particular in Calvinist areas, and tried to tax the Netherlands in new ways. And from the English perspective, they should support the Dutch for two reasons. And one is they didn't want the Spanish to have a strong base there, because they thought correctly that the Spanish would at some point invade. And the other is that they wanted to limit the expansion of Catholic power. So they at first financially support the Dutch Revolt and then intervene militarily. And so this is what provokes the Spanish into sending the Armada to try to destroy the English fleet and then invade England. And this is, again, one of these early representations of nationalism for England. From the English perspective, they were fighting for the home islands. This was a matter of national defense. And so when they defeat the Spanish Armada, this greatly strengthens that sense of national identity. It kind of pairs with the Reformation, where people think that this was intended by God, that England as a nation must be favored in some way for this armada to have been destroyed. And so coming out of this, you have this precedent that is set by Elizabeth of allying with Protestants, and again, as well, the political and religious problems. So let's jump to the commercial changes. Another thing that happens under Elizabeth is that the monarchy finances voyages around the world, or basically legalizes piracy by people like Sir Francis Drake on the Spanish. And so when Sir Francis Drake takes the main Spanish treasure ship, he is able to bring in the equivalent of millions upon millions of pounds today in sterling. So overall, what we see is an expansion of English shipping, an expansion of colonization, and the English, from the beginning, tended to have a close alliance between the members of their merchant class and the members of their nobility. So we talked about Elizabeth funding a lot of these things. This was very different from the attitude towards business in places like Spain. So the English, starting with Elizabeth, begin to launch these transoceanic voyages of exploration. And what adds urgency to this is their rivalry with Spain that we talked about, leading to war, their involvement in the war in the Netherlands, and then eventually their rivalry with countries like the Netherlands and France. And so the rivalry is going to prompt countries like England to believe that they have to take over areas in order to ensure that some other rival doesn't lock them out. So the English believe that they have to establish areas of control in places like India, because if they don't and the French do, then the French will slam the door in their faces. And so that is what's going to lead to greater and greater and greater control over overseas areas. So that is enlarging the middle class in England, is bringing in a lot of wealth, and that fuels what's called the consumer revolution. And so we touched on this with Europe as a whole. So what we would see in England is an ability to afford a lot of consumer goods like sugar that would have been out of reach for common people before this. And so this in turn fuels more exploration and expansion, because now there are goods that people think, I need these things. And so the kind of commercial and political parts of these become intertwined. We have companies, joint stock companies that emerge, like the East India Company, that in many ways act as a state. So they're acting for both economic and political reasons. And on the flip side of that, they are supported by the state. So it becomes difficult to separate the interests of owners of East India Company stock and the interests of the nation. And so the British government begins to back these companies up militarily. So what we have a shift to very early in England is more of a market economy. While the British were, like other European countries, in pursuing mercantilism, they always allowed a good deal of what we might consider proto-capitalism within the country. So while they were erecting mercantilist barriers against the French or the Netherlands and granting monopolies over East Indian trade to the East India Company, within England, it was very much a privately run and market-driven economy. And that is what's going to lead to even greater investment. And so starting in this time period, you already have early protections of what we would later consider private property. And so that's one of the reasons why we see these kinds of developments early in England. More wage earning, less peasantry, less of a use of peasantry. And so one example of this is enclosure. Enclosure is the commercialization of farmland in England. It was strongly supported by Parliament Parliament passed several acts of enclosure. And what this enabled large farm owners to do is to employ the latest information and technology to producing crops. So we can see the three-field system that they're using there, where now instead of allowing one field to be fallow or growing a crop that would drain the resources of that field, the British were growing turnips. And turnips were nitrogen fixing, so they enhanced the productivity of the soil while allowing the British to feed more of their livestock and keep their livestock around. So again, this fuels that consumer revolution, because the common people would have access to food goods that would have been considered the domain of the elite before this. So when we look at the chart at the bottom, we can see the transformation from 7% urban to 23% urban. I mean, that doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about England tripling its urban population in two and a half centuries. And you can see the precipitous drop in the agricultural population during that time. The other thing that the chart shows is rural non-agriculture. And so what that is getting to is what's called the cottage industry system or putting out system, sometimes called the domestic system. So increasingly then, these people in the countryside are engaged in manufacturing. And we would see this system take root the fastest in England and the Netherlands. And so this is going to enable merchants to meet demand more effectively. They were trying to deal with the fact that the old guild system was far too slow. So the AP exam this year is of course going to be a DBQ. So we're going to use some documents here and there to illustrate some points and to work on those document skills. So what we have here is a great illustration of the mercantilist barriers that the British were trying to erect around the empire. And this was especially true of the sugar-producing zones of the British Empire. So they weren't quite as worried about the northern 13 colonies, which were not economically valuable. So here he's talking about how there's a problem that there were so many French goods that were smuggled in daily from the French islands. So here is the intrinsic flaw in mercantilism. This idea that you enrich the nation by stockpiling gold and silver, what it does is it causes prices to go up. And so what has happened here is that as a result of mercantilist practices and as a result of the greater productivity in that part of the French world, it was cheaper to smuggle in goods from a rival than it was to buy those goods through the established mercantilist system. And so, of course, what's going to happen here is that the planters, the English planters, are going to appeal to the country, the government. The government is going to back them up, and so this kind of economic situation is going to drive a lot of the European conflicts. So looking at this in terms of perspective, there are a couple of ways of approaching this. One is what I just described, which is the context of the document. In this period, we see European countries trending in the direction of mercantilism, and so of course he's going to describe his opposition to French goods being smuggled in. And then the other part of this is that here is somebody stationed in the Caribbean. They would be firsthand witnesses to this, and so therefore he would be credible in describing some of the situations he has noted here. All right, so coming back to the political system, we left with Elizabeth papering over some of the problems with Parliament and the Puritans. And so what is happening at this point is you have England establishing a maritime global empire. That's expensive. There's the military revolution where we're forming gunpowder armies. That's expensive. And so the governments throughout Europe are attempting to centralize. And we've looked at this from the big picture. Countries that successfully centralize are going to thrive and countries that fail to centralize are going to be destroyed in Europe. So the question in England isn't so much should England centralize or should it not. The people who were running the political system all recognize the value of centralization, or mostly recognize the value of centralization. The question was, should that centralization occur under a king? Or should it occur more broadly under the ruling class, so under Parliament and the king? And so we get this resistance from not just the English nobility, but what we would call the English gentry, the landowning top tier of the middle class. They're going to ally with the nobility because both of those groups are represented in Parliament. And so they can use Parliament as a center of resistance pretty effectively. And so part of what we have going on here is in what form, the question of what form should centralization take. And part of what we have is a disagreement over the way English law works. So you have Archbishop Laud there. Archbishop Laud is going to make changes to the doctrines of the Church of England. And so there's this common law question then that comes up. The king, under the Act of Supremacy, is the head of the church. So does the king have the right to change the doctrines of the Church of England without asking Parliament? Or we could take this view. Does Parliament have the right to approve any major changes in the Church of England since Parliament created the Church of England under the Act of Supremacy? And so this is where the difference in interpretation is going to become critical. Now, the other resisting group is going to be the Puritans, who feel like the archbishops like Laud are trying to make the Church of England too Catholic, too hierarchical in structure, too much like the Catholic Church in its rituals and its interpretations. Now, the other thing that's going on is that as a result of the commercial changes we just looked at, there's tremendous social dislocation. You have a good deal of urban workers who are poor, concentrated in cities. That was fairly new. They're going to have a huge influence on this. And then we have the changes with regard to the middle class. You know, they're larger than before. They're better educated than before. They have more property than before. They want to be sure that a king can't just misuse their wealth. And so that a lot of these things are coming together to cause this kind of conflict. And so one example of this is the breakdown in community controls. So as people move from the village to the city, then one of the things that breaks down is the old ways of regulating morality. So who's going to regulate morality? And how much control should the people have over the regulation of morality? Is it up to the king and his archbishops to just tell you what is moral and what's not? That's exactly what the kings of England were trying to do at this point. Or should Parliament have some say in what the new regulations of morality are? Should we have a more broadly asserted regulation of morality? And so we're starting here with Charles I, but we can actually go back to his father, James I. James I was from Scotland, not from England. Remember, Elizabeth is the Virgin Queen, so she has no direct heirs, and she had killed her cousin, who is Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. So it goes to the son of Mary Stuart, and that's James. And James definitely wanted to be an absolute monarch. And so there's this tension between absolutism and resistance to absolutism. But where this really reaches a peak is under Charles I, who is not a great monarch, so he's a bad king on top of being attempting to be absolute and subverting English law. So Charles I, what he'll attempt to do is to use some traditional taxes, like taxes on imports, in new ways. He's going to try to restructure the Church of England so that he has greater control over it, what the Puritans saw as more Catholic. And that brings him into conflict with the Puritan leaders of Parliament. And so the conflict really reaches a peak when Charles I goes 11 years without summoning Parliament. When Parliament comes back, because Charles has gotten himself involved in a war with Scotland, Parliament is angry. They want to put Archbishop Laud on trial. They want to put several of Charles I's officials on trials. So Charles I responds by trying to arrest the leaders of Parliament, which was clearly unconstitutional. So all of that leads to war between the supporters of the king and the supporters of Parliament. And that's the Civil War. The Civil War is ultimately won by the forces of Parliament. And one of the leaders of the forces of Parliament was the guy in the top center, Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of an army that was referred to as the New Model Army, because it promoted more based on merit than your family ties and that sort of thing. And Cromwell had come to believe that Charles I was guilty of treason. And so when the majority of Parliament did not agree with Cromwell, he purged them. He sent them all packing and created what was called the Rump Parliament, a smaller version of Parliament that was more compliant, and Charles I was put on trial and found guilty of treason and executed. And so Cromwell then really isn't much different from the kings who tried to be absolute. He rules through military force. He's more or less a dictator. And so this is going to lead to the restoration of the monarchy. When Cromwell dies, Charles II, the son of Charles I, is invited to come back to England and reestablish the monarchy. And so the restoration is made with strings attached. The monarch has to agree to certain limitations on the monarch's power and to certain guarantees of rights. And so one of the things we would see in the restoration is that the English, at this point, recodify property. So property earlier, was considered more and more like private property, but it was still legally feudal, which meant that it was all technically controlled by the king. The Restoration redefines property as private property. This is a huge change because we're going to see the English financial system really take off after this. And it's difficult to see how England industrializes without this legal protection of property that occurs here. This is a passage from a book on the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. And here you can see part of the issue at hand. What does sovereignty mean? And the king was called the sovereign. And so he asks, he says, how could a sovereign be accused of treason when the meaning of treason was a crime against the sovereign? And he's the sovereign, he couldn't commit a crime against himself. And so the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution that's going to follow then are reinventing these things on the fly, and that was part of the difficulty. And so we'll see in other countries it doesn't go quite so well. So that's going to lead to the Glorious Revolution. The English Civil War, while it does make some changes in Parliament's favor because of Parliament's victory, does not cement the victory. So a second event is needed. James II is the Charles I of this situation. He is the king who lasts about 4 years because he tries to suspend laws of Parliament and critically has his son, who is the heir to the throne, baptized as a Catholic, which created this paranoia in England that the Pope was going to rule England or something along those lines. And so the Parliament invites William of the Netherlands, of the House of Orange, who was married to Mary, the daughter of James II, to come in and establish a monarchy. William had been actively campaigning for this, and so this establishment of a new monarchy is the Glorious Revolution, mostly bloodless, and it does result in the cementing of the changes. So the settlement of the Glorious Revolution involves things like the English Bill of Rights. And so there's this permanent shift that occurs as a result of the Glorious Revolution. I mentioned the financial takeoff that follows this. Below, we have the Bank of England. The Bank of England was created after the Glorious Revolution. The English use of modern banking techniques really takes off following this. So another of these foundations that will lead us into industrialization down the line. So what we have here is the kind of a revisionist interpretation of the Glorious Revolution. So traditional interpretations of the revolution ignore the extent to which the events of 1688 constituted a foreign invasion by the Dutch Republic. So the forces that the Prince of Orange amassed were vast, and they were essentially waiting for the event and crossed immediately. And so the fact that Parliament invited him does not change the fact that this was an illegal act. William was usurping the throne. So this is an alternative interpretation of that event. So we talked about the 17th and 18th century conflict in the military revolution in the context of Western Europe as a whole. So what I want to do here is focus on England's role. And so England, like the other European countries that have centralized, they're creating a professional army that is paid and equipped by the state. Most other European countries had done this under an absolute monarchy, and England has really done this under Parliament as well, instead. And so the War of the Spanish Succession is a war that England is brought into in large part due to that alliance with the Netherlands following the Glorious Revolution. And so this is the French attempting to incorporate Spain into their empire, opposed by England, the Netherlands, Austria, and Prussia. The coalition that fights France wins. And one of the things that the English extracted was the right to trade slaves in the Spanish colonies in the Americas. This was known as the Asiento. And so the Middle Passage becomes dominated by English merchants during this time. The other big conflict that really illustrates the English goals during the period was the 7 Years' War, which is a world war. The rivalry between England and France takes a conflict on the continent of Europe and turns it into a conflict that was fought in India and a conflict that was fought in North America. And the big winner of this conflict is England, as England is able to essentially eject the French from India and to take much of France's North American territory. And so coming out of this, England is on the rise and France is in trouble. And so we have this British domination, which is funded in large degree through those new financial practices. Unlike France, which falls into crippling debt as a result of these conflicts, England is more or less, with some bumps in the road, able to manage that debt. Now we know that one of the big problems is the British efforts to get the 13 colonies to try to pay this debt. That is one of the issues where they don't handle the situation quite so well. But using the Bank of England and those new financial instruments, the English are pretty good at getting at financing those kinds of wars. I said the Age of Reason. We're talking about the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. And so again, we want to talk about this from the English perspective, not the broad perspective of what they are. So in England, the most famous figures are going to be Francis Bacon and Newton. And so I'm going to hit those and talk about a few others. So what Francis Bacon does is he articulates the English philosophy about how to acquire knowledge. And so on the continent of Europe, what will become more popular is a deductive approach to reasoning. And Francis Bacon favors an inductive approach to reason and evidence. So empiricism is the use of hard, sense-based evidence to draw conclusions. And so the Enlightenment thinkers that follow are going to follow Bacon's lead. Now, Sir Isaac Newton, who discovers the law of gravity and some laws governing optics, is going to be so influential in establishing natural laws through reason that he asserts are always true, that we call the interpretation of physics that runs from this period until 1900 the era of Newtonian physics. And he was a giant during his time. He was a celebrity in England when he died. His funeral was attended by thousands of people lining a parade where his coffin, his casket was taken to the area where he was buried. Outside of physics and astronomy, William Harvey used dissection to understand how the heart pumped blood. And so what we see with both Newton and Harvey is a strong emphasis on that kind of empiricism that Bacon favored. Another empiricist, now bringing this in direction of the human world, would be John Locke. So he's arguing that it's a study of governments and how they operate that leads him to conclude that the government in England was formed as a result of a social contract. The people formed it in order to protect their life, liberty, and property. And so if the government breaks the contract, you can replace the government. So John Locke's ideas were used to defend the Glorious Revolution. So that is, we'll see that the French have a slightly different take on the social contract that will emerge during this time. That's one of the kind of foundational pieces of English political philosophy. The foundational piece of English economic philosophy is Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which was initially written as an attack on mercantilism, a use of reason to just rip apart mercantilism. But in ripping apart mercantilism, what Adam Smith is able to establish are these natural laws of economics. So he's arguing that he's taken the system of Newtonian physics and creating a system that governs economics as well. So one of the areas that was still in question then was women. How much of this applied to women? There were Enlightenment thinkers that argued that women were less capable of reasoning than men and therefore could be denied the same rights. And so Wollstonecraft is an Enlightenment thinker, a woman, an early feminist, you could say, who argues that women were just as capable of reasoning. And the first step in proving this is educating them at the same level. And once you educate them at the same level and they're able to use reason in the same way, they can begin to break away from these old roles and kind of reinvent their social place in society. The other thing we see during this time is the influence of Enlightenment rationalism on art. And so art becomes much more about developing citizenship and a public role for people. It's going to look back on Greece and Rome, which were the developers of the concept of citizenship. And so architecturally, we see this in St. Paul's Cathedral. After the Great Fire of London, the cathedral was built by Christopher Wren in that classical style, so the columns and domes. In writing, what we would see is the development of the modern novel in England. And so Jane Austen, one of the influential novelists of that day. Because of this application of reason to all areas of life, we also have improvements in public health that occur during this time. So the most noteworthy one is the English figure out how to inoculate people against smallpox. Now, they don't know how to create a vaccine yet. Edward Jenner will develop that later on. But they have figured out that if you infect people with a weaker strain of smallpox, they can fight it off. And so what we are getting during this time are new policies in cities that are making the cities a little bit safer. Now, the real changes will come with industrialization, but we're seeing that this change early on. The French Revolution, I'll talk about in detail when we get to France. But the thing about the French Revolution across the world is that there's this feeling that they're trying to do too much too fast, and people are appalled by the violence of the French Revolution. And so the kind of bigger picture here is that in the late Enlightenment era, in England, in France, and elsewhere, the people reading newspapers and people who were aware of what was going on in Parliament, they wanted Parliament to reform itself so that there was less corruption. They wanted more people to be able to vote. They wanted the electoral districts to be redrawn. And as in France, these reforms amounted to nothing at that point. And so there's this kind of growing demand for change. And so this built up pressure. But when the French Revolution happens, we're going to see people turn away from this. Now, the loss of the 13 colonies is going to have a real effect on England's colonial policy and their view of reform afterwards, because the feeling that emerges in England after the 13 colonies become the United States is that England brought this upon themselves. It was mismanagement of the colonies that resulted in this. And they don't want the same thing to happen in places like India. There is already this feeling that the Enlightenment is being applied and that England's system maybe isn't as flexible as it needs to be. But what poisons the well is the French Revolution, because the violence of that revolution allows people to argue that if you reform too quickly, then it's going to always lead to this kind of violence. And it's arrogant to try to reform as quickly as the French did. And this was articulated by the person who's known as the father of conservatism, Edmund Burke. So Edmund Burke is going to write a famous tract attacking the French Revolution. He sees the revolutionaries as arrogantly destroying institutions that had been built by a number of generations. The comparison he makes is one generation's wisdom to a dozen generations' wisdom. And how can one generation have more wisdom than all of these generations that preceded it? That's the arrogance that he's attacking here. And so the 13 colonies and their demands were seen as being acceptable, but the demands that were being made in France, those were too drastic. And so Edmund Burke is one of the figures in England who's wary of giving the right to vote to the lower classes, to working class men. So what occurs during this time is that the expansionist nature of the French Revolution is what cements this opposition, this British opposition to France. So now this becomes the newest chapter of the rivalry between France and Britain. And the French are like the Spanish of the Wars of Religion. If they come to control the Low Countries permanently, then they could launch an invasion of England, and so the English can't have that. So until Napoleon and the French agree that Belgium and the Netherlands will be independent, the English are going to oppose Napoleon. And so that is basically forever then. And so the opposition to Napoleon really turns the English away from reform. As now any kind of reform is associated with Napoleon and the French Revolution, and so the reform movements grind to a halt in England during this time. But England is successful in opposing Napoleon. The English have industrialized to some degree at this point, and so have far more money than the French do to fund this kind of war effort. And so the bottom left, you see the Battle of Trafalgar. So once the Battle of Trafalgar is won by the British, it's going to be a challenge for the French to ever win this conflict, even though the French army was superior to that of the British at this point. It was larger and better equipped. And so the defeat of Napoleon is going to lead to, in Europe, this resurgence of nationalism and intense national feeling. And so in England, Romanticism, it will involve kind of that nationalist sentiment, but it's tied pretty closely to a religious revival. So in American history, you learn about the Great Awakening. And so here what we have is a similar religious revival in England. This is when the Methodist Church is established during that Romantic period by John Wesley. And so Methodism is a good example of the more intuitive approach to religion that is created in response to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So in 1815, Napoleon is defeated for good. There is, at that point, already the meeting occurring in Vienna to establish a system to maintain peace and to prevent the spread of French revolutionary ideas. So Britain, at first, is a participant in that concert of Europe, that Congress system, even though the aims of the Concert of Europe seemed to go contrary to Britain's political system. And Britain already was the most liberal country in Europe and had much less in common with the absolute monarchies than it did with some of these revolutionary groups. And yet, Britain during the 1820s is going to repress this kind of demand for reform internally. And so for a while, Britain is a participant in that repression of liberalism, nationalism, and definitely radicalism that was associated with the Congress system. And the big example of this is the massacre at St. Peter's Field, which is nicknamed the Peterloo Massacre, kind of a play on Waterloo. And so this, what the British are doing is restricting protest movements, restricting the right to publish information critical of the government, restricting the right to gather publicly. All of that shows the British kind of turning away from their system. What we also want to look at during this period, this late 18th, early 19th century period, is British industrialization. And so the codification of private property I've gone over as well already. The British have the highest standard of living in Europe. And so per capita wealth is greater than anywhere else in Europe overall. And some parts of the Netherlands would rival the more urban parts of Britain, but that's it. They have a global market. And the problem that the British are facing at this point is they cannot produce enough goods to meet the demand that's out there. And so this is a unique problem in history, up to this point. If the British can make more, they can sell more. And so that's going to lead to this. So this development of a colonial empire has played a role in industrialization as well. Now, what happens in the early period is this is where we get lots of child labor. The British at first have some difficulty getting enough labor, so they empty out orphanages to work. You have 12, 14-hour work days. And so there's this working class that is unhappy with the way industrialization is going. And so that's what we mean by this instability. A new urban working class concentrated in the cities, aware of shared grievances. And so I have the Chartist meeting down there in the bottom left. The Chartists were a working class mass political movement. But this is a very good indication of how things go in England. The Chartists got their name from the People's Charter, which was a petition. So they were petitioning the government to make changes. And so the belief in the system in Britain was pretty strong in spite of it all. So we have this development then of mass politics as a result of the shift in industrialization. Mass working class politics, but also mass middle class politics to a greater degree than before. And so this in England is going to result in reforms. And areas that are in the British Isles that do not industrialize, what we can still have are local periodic famines. And so the Irish potato famine is an example of what happens in different pockets of Europe that are still pre-industrial. But it's also a good example of how imperial policies can make one of these situations worse. Because Ireland was more or less a colony of Britain at this point, and absentee landlords continued to extract taxes and rents from Ireland, even though the famine was going on, which took a bad situation and made it a catastrophic situation. There was a similar famine in part of Belgium at this point that has not gained the same place in history because the Belgian government actually took care of the people who were starving to death and didn't just worsen the situation. So a couple of legislative reforms to hit here. The big one is the 1832 Reform Bill, which grants the right to vote to much of the middle class. It doubles the electorate. That sounds great until you look at the numbers, and we're talking about 15% of England's population now being able to vote. But that does convince people that the government will respond to pressure. And so this gives hope to people who weren't granted the right to vote by the 1832 Reform Bill. This is followed by a series of factory reforms. Throughout the British Empire, slavery is abolished in the 1830s, and the slave trade is abolished as well. And so the British come to see their system as being responsive, as working, and so this is kind of the period where we have the two-party system taking off. So with the defeat of France and the industrialization of Britain, Britain has emerged as Europe's greatest power. And France was that greatest power for the period following the 30 Years' War. So they've slipped, and England has kind of taken that spot. And so it's during the midpoint of the 19th century that the British celebrate this achievement with the first World's Fair, this great exhibition. In the bottom right-hand corner, you have the Crystal Palace that was built as a symbol of Britain's industrial might.